At dawn on June 23, 1941, the world still didn't understand what had begun. Columns of German armor were already deep inside Lithuania, advancing toward the city of Raseiniai. Operation Barbarossa had started just one day earlier, and to the men of the Wehrmacht, it felt like destiny. The roads were filled with panzers, half-tracks, and endless convoys of gray-uniformed confidence. The Red Army, they believed, would crumble just as Poland and France had, but near a quiet river crossing on the Dubisa. One Soviet tank would prove that destiny could bleed. They called it simply the Heavy One, a KV-1, the newest and heaviest tank in the world. To German crews, it was a rumor more than a reality. A steel ghost said to shrug off direct hits, a machine no shell could penetrate. Most dismissed the stories. The Wehrmacht had seen hundreds of Soviet tanks already, thinly armored T-26s and BTs that burst into flames under a single 37mm shot. The so-called door knockers, as German gunners joked, were all they needed. Then, on that morning near Raseiniai, the joke stopped. The German 6th Panzer Division had crossed the Niemen and was driving toward the town with mechanical precision. Their mission was to secure the bridges and push east toward Dock Afpels. The Soviet 2nd Tank Division of the 3rd Mechanized Corps was in their path, but to the Germans, it was just another obstacle. By the evening of June 23rd, they'd overrun most of the Soviet forward units. Burned out T-26s and BT-7 South littered the fields. The road seemed open, but round midnight, a single KV-1 tank from the 4th Company of the 2nd Battalion went missing. No one noticed it leave formation. No one gave it orders to move. It drove alone into history. At first light, June 24, 1941, German supply trucks rolled down the main road to Raseiniai and stopped. A dark shape blocked the highway, parked squarely across the asphalt. Smoke rose faintly around it. Through binoculars, officers could see the red star on the turret, the massive barrel of a 76mm gun pointing straight down the road. It was motionless, silent, but it was alive. The first German panzer tried to move around it and was destroyed with a single shot. Another followed, and another. Each time, the KV's gun roared once, and another tank went up in flames. The entire road was soon littered with wreckage. At 9 o'clock a.m., the 1st Panzer Regiment called for artillery. They brought up a battery of 50mm and 75mm anti-tank guns, positioning them in the forest edge. The KV-1 didn't move. When the first shells struck, they sparked harmlessly off its armor. The German gunners adjusted their aim, fired again. Same result. The round simply bounced off. A Panzer IV commander later wrote in his report, "We fired from 400 meters, then from 200. The shells ricocheted as if we were shooting at a stone wall." The tank did not return fire for several minutes, as if contemptuous. When it finally answered, it destroyed both guns in less than a minute. By noon, panic had replaced confidence. The KV-1 had effectively cut the division supply line. Fuel trucks, ammunition convoys, even field kitchens were trapped behind it. The road to Raseiniai, the artery of the German advance, was blocked by a single Soviet tank. German engineers tried to flank it through the swampy fields, but the terrain bogged them down. Recon planes confirmed it wasn't part of a larger unit. Just one tank, one crew. Inside that steel fortress sat 5 men: Commander Lieutenant Zinovy Kolobanov, gunner Andrei Yusov, driver mechanic Sergei Evdokimov, loader Grigory Semyonov, and radio operator Alexander Postushin. They knew they were cut off. Their division was in retreat. The enemy was everywhere. But they also knew that as long as they held this road, the Germans could not move forward. And so, they stayed all day. The KV-1 held its ground. Artillery pounded the position. Smoke shells, high explosives, even direct 105mm howitzer fire, none of it broke through the armor. The tank's thick welded plates, up to 90mm at the front, were nearly impenetrable to every weapon the Wehrmacht possessed at the time. A German engineer team attempted to sneak up at night with satchel charges. They crawled through the mud, cutting through silence so deep it felt sacred. The KV's machine gun opened fire before they reached 10 meters. All of them died. By the morning of June 25th, the division's commander, General Erhard Rouse, was furious. He ordered 88mm anti-aircraft guns to be brought forward, the same weapons used to kill British heavy tanks in Africa. It took hours to position them. The KV-1 crew fired at every movement they saw. At 500 meters, the first 88 opened fire. The shell hit squarely on the turret and left only a dent. The second shot penetrated the mantlet, finally wounding the loader. But before the Germans could fire again, the KV rotated its turret and fired. The 88 exploded in flames. Still it did not fall. By now the Germans had surrounded the tank from all sides. They tried to approach under cover of smoke. Machine gun fire raked the KV's hull. Another 88mm gun opened fire from the rear. This time, the shell struck the engine deck. The explosion tore through the compartment, setting fuel lines ablaze. The crew inside knew it was over, but they kept firing. Witnesses from both sides would later recall that even as flames poured from the back of the tank, its gun still thundered. The machine fought until it could no longer move, until its shells ran out, until the silence was final. When German infantry finally approached the wreck, they found the KV-1 burned out but intact. Inside, the bodies of the crew were still at their stations. The main gun had fired its last round through the barrel, still locked in position toward the road it had defended. They counted 12 destroyed vehicles around it, 6 Panzers, 4 anti-tank guns, and 2 trucks. For one day and one night, a single Soviet tank had stopped an entire division. A German officer, years later, described it simply. It was not a tank. It was a fortress, a monument to madness and courage. When the smoke cleared over the Dubisa River, the German advance had stopped for nearly 36 hours. An entire division, thousands of men, hundreds of vehicles, delayed by one tank. In the rapid rhythm of blitzkrieg, that kind of pause was fatal. Every hour mattered. Every kilometer of road meant fuel, coordination, and momentum. The German High Command didn't understand at first why the 6th Panzer Division had stalled. Then the reports came in. Enemy heavy tank blocking supply route. All attempts to destroy it unsuccessful. To General Erhard Rouse, this sounded like nonsense. He had personally commanded dozens of engagements. No tank was invincible. No crew could hold forever. But reconnaissance photographs confirmed it. The road to Raseiniai was littered with burned German armor. In the center of it all, still smoldering, stood the blackened silhouette of a KV-1. Rouse wrote later, "It was the first time we encountered a tank whose armor was immune to everything we had." For the German army, the encounter at Raseiniai was more than a battlefield anomaly. It was a revelation, a warning that the Eastern Campaign would not be another France, not another Poland. The enemy they faced now could build machines that defied their weapons. Men who defied logic, and resistance that defied reason. The KV-1 at Raseiniai became legend within days. Stories spread across German units of a single tank that fought without rest, that fired until its ammunition ran out, that forced engineers to drag 88mm guns through mud just to end its defiance to the Soviets. It became something else, a miracle, a symbol of endurance when everything around them collapsed, because, by the end of that same week, almost the entire 2nd Tank Division of the Red Army had been destroyed. Dozens of KV tanks were lost, hundreds of men captured. The division itself ceased to exist as a fighting force. But one tank, one moment, survived in memory. The KV-1 was not designed for glory. It was designed for necessity. Named after Kliment Voroshilov, a Soviet marshal more political than technical. The tank was conceived in the late 1930s as a breakthrough weapon, a fortress on tracks. It weighed 47 tons, twice that of a German Panzer III. Its armor was up to 90 millimeters thick. Its 76 millimeters gun could destroy any German vehicle of 1941 with a single hit. The Soviets had believed in mass and armor. The Germans had believed in speed and precision. At Raseiniai, those two philosophies met, and steel decided which would bend first. The German 37 millimeters pack guns, nicknamed door knockers by their own crews, couldn't penetrate even the rear of the KV. Even the Panzer IV short 75 millimeters gun, meant to destroy bunkers, was ineffective beyond point-blank range. The only solution was to bring the feared 88 millimeters, an anti-aircraft gun turned tank killer. But even that, on its first shot, failed to finish the job. It wasn't just a mechanical mismatch. It was psychological. Inside the KV-1, the 5 Soviet crewmen endured what no training could prepare them for. The heat, the concussion of impacts, the claustrophobia. Every few minutes, another shell slammed into the armor. Sparks sprayed inside from bolts and rivets. The air turned metallic, thick with smoke and cordite. The loader's arm burned from shrapnel, but he kept feeding shells. The gunner's hands bled from recoil. They spoke little, conserving oxygen and focus. Each knew what staying meant. Each stayed anyway outside. The German infantry tried to advance under the cover of artillery smoke. The KV fired short, rapid bursts from its machine guns, cutting them down in seconds. Some tried to crawl closer with grenades. None returned. A field surgeon in the 6th Division's medical unit later described the aftermath. The men said it wasn't a tank, it was a bunker. It killed everything that moved, then went silent, and when you thought it was dead, it fired again. As the day turned to night, German units built fires behind their lines, exhausted. The KV still stood on the road, silent, immovable, glowing faintly from the heat of battle. Some said they heard its engines start again around midnight, a low rumble echoing through the woods. Others said it was just the wind in the wreckage. By morning, the tank was quiet. German engineers approached carefully, crawling through the ditches, rifles aimed. The closer they came, the clearer the horror became. The entire road was cratered, with impact marks. Over 100 hits counted on the KV's armor. Only one shell had pierced it from the rear, and that only by luck. Inside, all 5 men were dead, burned but still in position. The gun breech was locked open. The last shell casing was still warm. A soldier who witnessed it later wrote in his diary, "They died with the gun ready. They were not soldiers anymore. They were part of the tank itself." The Germans buried the crew near the field. For a few days, they even marked the site with a wooden cross. An uncommon gesture of respect in a war that rarely allowed such moments. But by July, the front had moved far east, and the story of the Raseiniai tank faded into rumor again. For the Soviets, the war turned darker still. By December, the Red Army had lost nearly 20,000 tanks. The KV, once a symbol of invincibility, became another desperate instrument in a losing war. Yet among the shattered divisions, the legend of the tank that never stopped lived on. It passed from retreating crews to new recruits, from frontline whispers to official reports. They called it the Raseiniai Fortress. Years later, when captured German officers were interrogated about the early days of Barbarossa, many mentioned it, not as a military event, as a shock. General Ross himself, in his memoir Panzer Operations, devoted an entire passage to the tank. The single heavy tank delayed our advance longer than any organized resistance. Its armor rendered all conventional weapons ineffective. Our troops spoke of it with a mixture of respect and disbelief. He also admitted something else, that the Raseiniai encounter forced the German army to completely rethink its anti-tank doctrine. After that day, the 88 mm gun became standard in every division. New tank designs were accelerated. The Tiger, the Panther, all born from the need to defeat what one Soviet crew had proven possible. In Moscow, few ever learned the names of the men inside that KV-1. Soviet records were chaotic. Some sources credited Lieutenant Smirnov's crew, others claimed it was commanded by Lieutenant Shidkov. The truth remains uncertain, but their act of resistance, whether by order or instinct, entered military legend. In 1965, a memorial was built near Raseiniai. It shows a KV-1, dark and silent, its barrel pointing toward the road. The inscription reads, "Here stood a tank that did not retreat." To this day, no one knows exactly how long it held. Some say 24 hours, others 48. But every account agrees on one thing: it stopped an army. The echoes of Raseiniai didn't fade in the chaos of 1941. They multiplied. What began as a single incident, one tank halting one division, rippled through both armies like a cold realization. The war on the Eastern Front would not be fast, and it would not be clean. In Berlin, the first reports of Soviet heavy armor reached the Waffen, the German armament office, by early July. At first, they were dismissed as exaggerations. The staff officers, reviewing the documents, marked the claims unlikely. A Soviet tank immune to 37 millimeters and 50 millimeters fire. Impossible. But as more divisions reported similar encounters near Minsk, Smolensk, and Pskov, disbelief turned to alarm. For years, the Wehrmacht had been conditioned to win through movement, through precision, through elegant destruction. The T-26 and BT tanks they had faced were fragile. One burst of 20 millimeters autocannon fire, and they were done. But the KV series, and its lighter counterpart, the T-34, broke that illusion completely. At one meeting in August 1941, an engineer from Krupp reportedly laid a Soviet armor plate sample on the table and said, "Gentlemen, this is the end of our 37s. The KV-1 forced the Germans into a new reality. Their entire anti-tank strategy had to be rewritten overnight. The 37 millimeters guns that had crushed Poland and France were now obsolete. Even the 50 millimeters Pak 38, a weapon of pride in 1940, could not reliably penetrate Soviet armor. The stopgap solution came from Africa, the Flak 88, originally an anti-aircraft weapon. It had the velocity and range to pierce a KV's armor from over a kilometer away. After Raseiniai, every German division was instructed to deploy at least one 88 mm battery directly in anti-tank roles. But it wasn't just a tactical change. It was psychological. German tank crews began calling the KV-1 Das Ungeheuer, the monster. Some believed the Soviets had foreign help, that these tanks were built with American steel or German blueprints stolen years before. Others simply refused to believe they were man-made at all. For Soviet designers, the story was more humble. The KV wasn't born from brilliance, it was born from necessity. In 1938, at the Kirov plant in Leningrad, engineers under Joseph Kotin had been ordered to create a heavy tank capable of breaking through fortified lines, a steel battering ram for future wars. They built 3 prototypes, the SMK, the T-100, and a single-turret variant that became the KV. During the Winter War in Finland, the KV's armor shrugged off Finnish guns completely. That was enough. It went into production immediately. It was crude, heavy, slow, but it was unbreakable. The Raseiniai tank was one of the earliest production models, thick-welded, with early optics and a cumbersome transmission that broke easily. And yet, even with all its flaws, it was the most powerful tank in the world. On June 24, 1941, the German generals couldn't ignore that fact. Heinz Guderian wrote in his personal notes later that year, "The Russian tanks are superior to ours in every way. The T-34 and KV are the best tanks in the world." For an army that had prided itself on being unstoppable, such words were unthinkable. But they were true. Raseiniai was not just a story of defiance, it was a preview of Germany's greatest nightmare, a war of attrition against machines that refused to die. By September 1941, German engineers were already drafting blueprints for new tanks. Krupp, Henschel and Mann were all ordered to submit designs that could withstand the 76 mm gun and defeat heavy Soviet armor. The requirements were unprecedented: -80 to 100 mm frontal armor, a gun capable of penetrating 100 mm of steel at 1,000 meters. Wide tracks for soft terrain. It was the birth of the Tiger and Panther projects. The Tiger, inspired by brute force, 57 tons and 88 mm cannon, and thick armor. The Panther, inspired by fear and near copy of the T-34 slope design. Its angles stolen from the machine that had humiliated them. Both of these tanks, icons of German engineering, were, in their own way, children of Raseiniai. But in 1941, while the Germans sketched their answers, the Red Army was still fighting for survival. For every KV that held the line, a dozen were abandoned for lack of fuel, ammunition, or spare parts. Entire regiments were encircled. Crews fought to the last shell, then set fire to their own tanks before capture. The KV's heavy armor could stop shells, but it couldn't stop the tide of blitzkrieg. By December, nearly all KV units from the Western Front had been destroyed. But something deeper had changed. The story of Raseiniai and others like it became the backbone of Soviet morale. Propaganda units rattled the tale endlessly. A lone tank, a handful of men stopping an entire German division. For a nation watching its cities burn, it was a story worth believing. And belief in 1941 was as vital as armor. In Leningrad, as German artillery surrounded the city, workers at the Kirov plant continued building tanks even under bombardment. They welded in the dark between air raids, using headlights from trucks when the power failed. Every tank that rolled out carried a small inscription on its turret. For Raseiniai, for them, the name wasn't a place anymore. It was an oath. German soldiers who had survived that early summer never forgot what they saw. Some called it insanity. Others called it courage. But all of them knew one truth. There was no logic to what those 5 men did inside that KV. It went beyond orders, beyond discipline, beyond reason. When a Soviet war correspondent visited the Raseiniai battlefield after the war, he described the burned-out KV still standing by the road, rusted but intact. He climbed onto the turret, touched the gun barrel, and wrote, "It was not just a tank. It was a promise, made in steel, that this land would not kneel." As the war dragged on, the KV would be replaced by new machines, the KV-85, the IS-1, and the mighty IS-2 with its 122 mm gun that could shatter any German tank. But those designs carried something inherited, something invisible, the will of that crew, that machine, that moment when the impossible became real. By 1943, the tide had turned. Soviet tanks were no longer the desperate few, they were the flood. And in the brief pauses between offensives, some soldiers would still whisper, half in awe, half in superstition, "Do you remember the tank that stopped the Germans?" When the war finally ended in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins, and with it, most of the machines that had shaped its fate. The KV-1 South that once dominated the battlefield were now ghosts of another age, burned-out hulks scattered across fields, riverbanks, and forests from Leningrad to Warsaw. But somewhere in Lithuania, near a small bend in the Dubysa River, one of them still stood. Locals called it the Iron Grave. Farmers plowed their land around it, soldiers passed by it, but no one dared to remove it. For years after the fighting ended, its turret was still visible above the grass, its barrel rusted but unbroken. Children climbed it, old men saluted it, and everyone knew the story, not from books, but from memory. The German veterans who had fought at Raseiniai carried their own memories. Some tried to forget, others couldn't. When former Commander Erhard Ross wrote his memoirs in the early 1950s, he devoted an entire chapter to that tank, a rare moment of humility in an otherwise technical account of blitzkrieg operations. He wrote, "That one tank held our division for a day and a half. We lost men, guns, and time. It was as though the earth itself had risen against us. The men who fought inside it deserved honor, even if they were our enemies. For a German general to say that, in that time, was extraordinary. But even he knew there was no denying what had happened. In the Soviet Union, the official story changed many times. The crew's names were lost in the confusion of early war records. Some claimed it was commanded by Lieutenant Smirnov. Others said it was Zhidkov or Kolobanov. None of them survived, and none of them were there to correct the record. But the myth grew stronger than the facts. By 1944, the tale of the tank that never stopped appeared in Soviet newspapers, children's magazines, and political speeches. It was used to remind the nation of its endurance, proof that even in the blackest year, there had been defiance. To the west, it was just another battlefield anecdote. To the east, it became scripture. When peace returned, the fields around Raseiniai slowly healed. Wildflowers grew where the trenches had been. The burned pines along the road sprouted new shoots. But when the Red Army engineers returned to survey the ground in 1946, they found the KV's remains still there, sunken half into the earth, its armor peppered with scars, but its silhouette unmistakable. Inside the wreck were fragments of uniforms, twisted shell casings, and bones fused with steel. The remains of the crew were carefully removed and buried nearby under a simple granite slab. No names, no ranks, only the inscription. They held the line. In 1965, for the 20th anniversary of victory, the Soviet government raised a new monument at the site. A restored KV-1 was brought from a scrapyard in Leningrad, cleaned, painted in dark olive, and placed on a concrete pedestal above the old road. It faces west, toward the direction the Germans came from. The inscription on the base reads, "Here in June 1941, the crew of a KV-1 tank halted the advance of fascist forces for 2 days. The locals began leaving flowers every spring. Truck drivers honked their horns when passing. Veterans from both sides visited in silence. No speeches, no politics, just silence. By the 1980s, the story had been riddled countless times. Historians debated the details. How long the tank had lasted, how many vehicles it had destroyed. Some said it was 22 hours. Others said 48. Some claimed 12 enemy tanks destroyed, others 18. But numbers didn't matter anymore. The story's power came from what it represented, not victory, but resistance. In the archives of the Soviet Ministry of Defense, one note stands out. It was written by a field engineer who had inspected the wreck back in 1941, just after the battle. His handwriting is fade, but one sentence is clear. "I touched the armor. It was still warm." Even decades later, that detail survived every retelling. The idea that something human remained inside that steel long after the guns went silent. In Western literature, Raseiniai became a footnote in the vast machinery of Operation Barbarossa, a curiosity, a tale of stubborn Soviet defense amid disaster. But for those who understood the Eastern Front, it was something more. It was the moment where certainty cracked, when the invincible Wehrmacht learned that not everything could be outflanked, outgunned, or outmaneuvered. One tank had shown that courage could be a weapon. Modern engineers still study the KV's armor. The crude welding, the immense plates, the flawed transmission. It was a paradox of design. It was inefficient, but unstoppable. It was heavy, but pure. It wasn't perfect engineering. It was raw defiance in metal. Every tank built after, from the IS-2 to the T-90, carries something of that legacy, not in the bolts or the rivets, but in the principle that a machine's worth is measured not in design elegance, but in the will of those inside it. There is a story told by an old Lithuanian farmer who lived near the road. He said that during the first night of fighting, when the gunfire finally stopped, he heard something strange coming from the tank, not an engine, not a gun. It was a song, faint, muffled, but unmistakably human. He said he heard Russian voices singing inside the KV before dawn, when the whole world around them was burning. When asked years later if he believed it was real, he said, "I don't know. Maybe the steel remembers. In the end, the men inside that tank didn't live to see what they changed. They didn't know that their stand would echo through history, shaping the weapons of both sides, inspiring generations, or that their silent machine would stand forever on a hill by the Dubisa. They only knew that they were alone, that they were surrounded, and that the road behind them led home. They held it until there was nothing left to hold. When you visit Raseiniai today, the air is quiet. You can hear the wind in the grass, the hum of distant traffic, and if you stand close to the memorial, you can still see the outline of the old highway disappearing into the forest. The KV's barrel points west, the same direction it did in June 1941. Its steel is cold now, but if you run your hand along the armor, the scars are still there, and maybe, just maybe, beneath all the rust and paint, there is still warmth.